Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Chats with Kat on the Voice of Adoptees podcast.
And I hope everyone is having a great week so far. Don't forget to grab your coffee, tea, or a preferred beverage and settle on in. I'm currently here with Howard, who is an author with his memoir entitled Already Home, Confronting the Trauma of Adoption. So, Howard, welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, Kat. Well, thank you for having me on Voice of Adoptees. This is a real privilege, and it's not an opportunity I get all that often. So it's just going to be fun. I'm 67 years old. I live in Southern California, and a fun fact about me is that I am on President Gerald Ford's Secret Service daily diary because in 1976 I had a chance to meet him in a rope line. So my name was included on the daily diary. It's a 20-page PDF that the Secret Service keeps of everything a president does from the minute he wakes up to the minute he goes to sleep. And my name is a footnote to a footnote. So that's a fun fact.
Wow, that's actually pretty big. I did not expect that. That is interesting. Oh my goodness. Well, let's get into it. So you started your adoption journey, obviously, when you were adopted. And you said you're from California. So why don't we start at the beginning?
The beginning. Okay. Well, I grew up in Wisconsin. I was born in 1956. So my adoption took place in that time frame long before Roe, when, the story was that young mothers did not want to have another child, were sent away. There's a book that I read in the research for writing my memoir called The Girls Who Went Away. And it was a documentation of the young women's lives, how they were changed by their pregnancy and then the adoption. And the typical story was that, if you got pregnant in the 50s or earlier, or in the 60s before Roe v. Wade gave you options, often you were sent to a family member or some other place to complete your pregnancy, give birth, and then turn the child over to an orphanage, a hospital, the state, a variety of other places. And I discovered, I've known ever since I was 3 or 4 years old that I was adopted. It was never a secret for me. My mom and dad, my adoptive parents, followed the advice that a lot of doctors and other professionals gave them when they had an adopted child, and just referred to me every time they would talk to me as our adopted son. They would use the adjective adopted anytime they talked to me, until I finally spoke up and said, whoa, what is this adopted business? Now, when I was 3 or 4, I probably didn't put it quite that way, but at some point, and they anticipated this, they were hoping that sooner or later I'd say, whoa, what's this whole adopted thing? And they gave me their answer. And I'm sure it was an answer that a 3 or 4-year-old would understand. And I said, okay, cool. What's for lunch? And I just moved on. And they stopped referring to me as their adopted son. And I just dealt with it. So I grew up in an upper middle class family. My father was a physician. My mother was a scientist, a stay-at-home mom. I was the first of 4 kids. The first 2 of us, me and my sister, were both adopted, different birth mothers. And then my parents had 2 kids of their own. And I had a wonderful life. And I had absolutely no desire, no interest to know anything about my birth family, other than what my dad eventually shared with me. I must have been maybe in high school. He gave me a note, and the note I still have it in my collection of letters that I've kept from friends and family. It was a list of bullet points about my birth mother. I mean, obviously it was a closed adoption, as was the case for most adoptions, in that era. So he had information like she was 5'3", she was slender, 120 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes, attractive. She liked to draw, a couple of little tidbits. There was a little information about my birth father. That was it. It's like, okay, that's all I needed to know. I had no interest in finding out more. because I had an idyllic life. I guess without being able to quote directly from my book, it was something along the lines of I had a Disney and Big Boy and Howdy Doody and Wagon Train kind of life growing up in the 50s and 60s. And it's like, why do I need to know about this woman who didn't want me?
Yeah.
I got this great life here. Like, who cares? And it was decades before the curiosity bug awakened within me, and it was precipitated by you might call it an incongruous event. You want me to just keep going and tell the story?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. This is interesting.
I grew up in Milwaukee. My profession, I became an advertising professional, an advertising copywriter and creative director,
Right.
and the nature of the work meant that I traveled. I moved a lot. So I started my career in Milwaukee. I moved to Chicago, then I went to LA, then I went to Minneapolis, and I went to New York, and I came back to LA. It's like I bounced around the country.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I was living in LA the second time, 2013, 2014, I met a woman and we started dating. We got involved. It was a romantic relationship. Even though I was an open and practicing, or I was an open bisexual. I was very clear with my
Right.
my girlfriend about this, and we eventually got engaged. But the relationship had its ups and downs, and we decided, or I suggested, that we go into
Right.
couple therapy because I really wanted to keep this relationship going. We found a therapist, and on the first day of therapy, my girlfriend turned to me 10 minutes
Right.
into the conversation. We basically introduced ourselves to the therapist. And 10 minutes into the conversation, my girlfriend turned to me and said, "Tell the therapist about your adoption." Because I had told her about my adoption. I was open. It's nothing I've ever hidden. It was just like, hey, I'm a writer. I'm an advertising guy. I like to do yoga. I was adopted, and I like to read. It's just one of 17 things about who I am, right?
I'm going to stop you for a moment
And
because I
so
want to make an observation.
Go ahead.
Uh, I find it interesting that specifically your girlfriend said, talk about the adoption. I believe many people who are not adopted think that adoption itself is a sort of trauma, right? And this was kind of your girlfriend's way of saying, like, any issues we have, maybe it stems back to that.
That's a really interesting observation, Kat, and I think only another adoptee would really get that. And so I didn't quite understand why she was bringing this up,
Mhm.
because I thought it was a complete non sequitur. So my thinking
Mhm.
was, she knows something about adoption that she's never spoken to me about,
Right.
because we talked a little bit about my adoption, but nothing in depth. So she knew something that she wasn't telling me, and like you said, she thought there was something related to my adoption that was a part,
Right.
big part, small part, for this challenge in our relationship. So 10 minutes into the conversation, she says, "Tell her about your adoption." And my reaction was, "What the heck does that have to do with anything? Right? What
Mhm.
does that have to do with anything?" Well, it turned out, without my knowledge, and I just didn't know this in advance, the therapist that I had found, I took the responsibility of doing the research and finding a therapist for us. And it turned out that this therapist had a subspecialty, and guess what? She had a handful of clients who were adoptees. And without telling me these adoptees' attitudes or situations, which is, client doctor patient privilege, she just said, "No, I have a subspecialty. I work as," and she said, "And I'm also adoptive mother. I have an adoptee." So it's like, whoa. Now this happened 2 years before I found out that the state of Wisconsin, my home state,
Right.
had changed its laws so that previously closed adoptions would be opened up under special circumstances. If the adoptive parents or mother was still alive, you had to, with your application, you sent a 2-page form you filled out and $40. and then you had to write a paragraph to the birth mother saying if she was still alive, requesting permission from her to see the records. So you had to explain why do you want to do this. So you were obligated to write this paragraph, and then the state would go check to see, is she still alive? If she's still alive, they'll send the paragraph. Well, it turned out that she'd passed decades earlier.
Right.
So this therapy that I was in to try to hold this relationship together happened 2 years before any of that took place.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that this therapist also had the subspecialty meant that once my relationship fell apart, and it did fall apart, we broke up, and it was a sad ending, but it broke up. Mm-hmm. I kept working with the therapist just because I wanted to work out the grief that I was feeling at the end of the relationship. And I was curious to learn more about adoption because I was not plugged in at all.
Right.
And that's when she said, there's a book I think you should read, mm-hmm. which will help you about adoption. And it was Nancy Verrier's book. And it wasn't even The Primal Wound. It was the second book. It was Coming Home to Self. She recommended I read that. And I tell you what, it was a dense, intense, difficult read. And I am a bit of an intellectual. I have an advanced degree. I'm studying literature. Close reading is not foreign to me. I'm a writer. I'm a teacher. So I'm accustomed to this. And it was a slog getting through this, not because it was difficult because I didn't understand it, but because every other page I would get pissed off and throw the book across the room. I'm not kidding you. I would throw the book across the room because it's like, can I swear?
Yeah, sure.
I said, who the fuck do you think you are? You don't know me. This is nothing about my life. Mm-hmm. And yet I had no way to counter her argument other than my own lived experience.
I love that. Yeah, I know what you mean.
And that's not enough. I mean, as someone who is grounded in science, grounded in research, grounded in evidence-based argument, I thought, okay, she's wrong. She doesn't know anything about me. She's not 100% wrong because, there are some things that she described about the behavior and the personality quirks of adoptees that were not wrong.
Right.
This became the impetus for some pretty serious deep thinking. And I would share my thoughts and reactions as I would read this book with my therapist. And my therapist paid me the compliment by saying, you're the only person who I've worked with to whom I've recommended the book, who's actually read the book.
Yeah.
I said, okay, that's not a big compliment because, I'm not the kind of person who, if I get 10 pages, 100 pages into a book and I disagree with the author, I'm going to put it aside and say, screw you. No, right. I want to read the whole thing. I want to absorb the argument so that I am aware and then I can counter it when I disagree with it. And it 2 years went by. It took me 1.5 years to really get through this book. I also found her second book, which is actually her first book, called The Primal Wound.
Right.
Now, The Primal Wound is a lot more approachable. It's less dense. It's a little bit more user-friendly. I wish I'd read that first, but that's not how it happened. I ended up reading both books, still disagreeing. I mean, if I pulled out my copies and opened them up, you'd see the pages highlighted, paragraphs highlighted, comments, right. and it's like, no. So about the time I finished, about a week after I finished reading the books, talk about a sign. I got a text from my sister, Mary Jo, the other adopted. She's my younger sister. She's 2 years younger. She was also adopted. Mm-hmm. And by the way, she always wanted to find her birth mother. She told me that as we were growing up.
Right.
And it's like, okay. I listened. I paid attention. I didn't discourage her. I didn't encourage her. I simply listened. I mean, she was my adopted sister. It was kind of like we had a little secret. It was like we had our own private language, just the two of us. We were the only ones in the family who talked about adopted moms and birth moms, adopted dads and birth dads. Right. My younger brother, younger sister, they were significantly younger, 5 or 6 years younger than us.
Right. So they didn't understand.
They didn't understand in the first place, but this was like our private. And I think adoptees would understand that. It's like, This is our little world.
Yes.
And we were talking in our own private language without really knowing it. We just did. So because I never had this desire, but she did, I thought, well, let me just pay attention. Maybe she'll say something that'll change my mind. She never did, but I always, whenever she talked about it, it's like, tell me more. So she texted me a week after I finished reading these books by Nancy Berrier saying, hey, guess what, Howard? The state of Wisconsin will now let us get our adoption reports. I just sent in my request. You should do it too. Let me send you the link. I thought,
Right.
okay, I'm talking to this therapist about my adoption. I'm learning stuff about research I didn't know existed.
Right.
I broke up with a girlfriend, which I don't think it had anything to do with adoption, but it was a precipitating factor here.
Mhm.
I thought, okay, it's $40. It's 2 pages of a form. What the heck? Why not? How hard can it be? So I was about 3 weeks behind her. She had sent hers off not quite a month earlier. I sent it off. Although I have to admit, I sat on the idea for about a month. I just like, let me think about this. So it took me a month to finally say, okay. I got my results 3 weeks later, and I realized, wow, that was quick. I hadn't put 2 to 2 together to realize the reason they sent it so quickly is because birth mom was dead.
Right.
And that was the first message. The first message from the adoption. She worked for the Department of Families and something or other at the state of Wisconsin, and I forget what her title was, but she sent me this email saying, I'm sorry to inform you, but your birth mother died in 1976. I've
Right.
attached the obituary and also the obituary for her first husband who had died some years, many, many years earlier, like in the 50s.
Right.
In a few days, I'm going to send you, she told me in this email, I'm going to send you the full report, a PDF of the full report, and that will be followed up by the actual hard copy of the report. So
Right.
I got the report as an email PDF, and I opened it up, and it was 33 pages, often single spaced. And I started scrolling, and I was scrolling, and I was scrolling, and I was scrolling. It's like, holy moly, this is like, I said, I can't deal with this. It's just too much. A week later, the hard copy thing arrived in the mail. It was a big envelope. I still have it. I pulled it out, and I realized this is like a time capsule because this is exactly what's been in a file somewhere, buried in a file cabinet somewhere in the state of Wisconsin. She just grabbed it, copied it, stuck it in an envelope, and sent it.
Right.
It read, as I said to you as we were talking earlier, it read like a little mini thriller.
Yeah.
Because first of all, she was not the typical birth mother that I had read about, which I read about later. I didn't realize it at the time. But as I was doing research about this, I read the girls who went away,
Right.
a year or so later, I realized that she wasn't the typical birth mom. The typical birth mom, I'm sorry, let me take that back. She was the typical birth mom. The vision that some people have of the birth mom is this young teenager who gets pregnant on her first experience. Well, that does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but the typical birth mom, the one depicted in this book, was she was in her mid to late 20s.
Right.
She had already been married. She was either widowed or divorced, and she already had kids. That was my birth mom. My birth mom was 26 years old when I discovered her identity. She had 2 daughters from her previous marriage who were all of a sudden now I had some siblings I didn't know about, half siblings.
Yeah.
Right. But no birth father was identified. And birth fathers they're not legally required to identify those birth fathers in these reports. But I had a name for my birth mother. And, she was born and raised in Wisconsin, but her life was in South Carolina because she had been in the military. So long story short, I had the identity of the birth mother and I had the identity of 2 siblings, but I couldn't find them. All the typical stuff you do, Google search, just nothing. So it was I had to put on my Sherlock Holmes cap and bring out my Sherlock Holmes pipe and play Sherlock Holmes and see if I can find, this was like, okay, I got to go on this adventure. I've started this thing. I'm not going to stop now. So I went from this guy in, grade school and high school. It's like, whatever. I'm just going to hang out with my buddies to, oh my God, oh my God, I've got sisters. I can't find them. I want to know, and who's this birth father? The birth records, the birth report referred to this. Oh, it was filled with acronyms. 2 and 3 letter acronyms. It's like, what do these things mean? And it took a while, but I finally figured out what some of these acronyms meant. And they were nothing, it's not like national secrets or anything, but they did. This is anyone who works in any kind of industry recognizes very quickly that industry has its own inside lingo. It uses its own private language. It's a shortcut. It's a way to talk quickly without having to explain everything. And social workers do it too. And so this is social worker language when they're dealing with birth mothers and adoptions and things. So I had to break this code. I was like, okay, I'm feeling like I'm in the CIA and I'm trying to break the Nazi code here to win the war. But for me, it was just, what the heck are they talking about? So there was these 2 letters that I kept encountering that I couldn't figure out. AF. Is this the initial? Is this my birth father's initials?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on here?
Right.
I got these other ones like, there was one like MGM. Maternal grandmother.
Oh.
Right. So MGM was it's not the movie studio. It's so little things like that. But AF kept repeating itself throughout this adoption report.
Right.
And I couldn't figure it out. But so I had to do what any good close reader does. You figure it out from context. When was the term AF used, and how was it used, and why was it used?
Mm-hmm.
So I read the report 3, 4, 5 times, and I tell you what, Kat.
Yeah.
The first time I read it, it was like, oh my God, this is just too much. I raced through it. Right. I barely saw the words. I grabbed a word here and there. It was just too much to absorb because I went from knowing absolutely nothing other than what Dad had shown me years earlier to this 33 pages doesn't sound like a heck of a lot, but when it's single-spaced interviews,
yes.
Oh my goodness! So it was a shock to get this information. It took 2 or 3 times of reading it before I could slow down enough to start absorbing the meaning of the words and what she was saying, and then trying to understand. Oh, is she saying this because she really believes this, or is she trying to paint a nice picture for the adoptive family so they would be more likely to take me, or is it someplace in between? And, does she have an agenda?
Yes.
So all of this stuff that, my training in literature, reading literature and reading poetry and trying to interpret literature has really helped.
Right.
But it still was, I had to get past the emotional fog, the emotional turmoil of having this information in front of me, letting my system kind of calm down, and going through it. And I finally figured out what AF meant. And it helped not one whit. It's just like, okay, I figured it out, but it doesn't tell me. Right. It stood for alleged father.
Oh, interesting.
Alleged father.
Right.
And it turns out that this is what the adoption specialist for the state of Wisconsin had said to me in an email. It says, we do not reveal the name of the alleged father, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But she didn't use AF. She just said alleged father in the context of the email.
Right. So
I had to go back to that email and read it again. It's like, alleged father. Oh.
Right.
And I finally wrote her an email saying, does AF mean alleged father? And she said, yes.
Got it.
So little things like that just kind of drove me up the wall.
Right.
But it allowed me to put together 2 + 2, and I finally figured out the identity of my birth father. And I'm not going to tell anymore because it's revealed in the story. And it had a huge impact on me because there were more siblings involved.
Right.
That I didn't know about.
Yeah.
Right? So a week after I finished reading these books by Nancy Berrier, who just did not set well with me, and I just didn't like her thinking.
Right.
I get this text from my sister, and I begin the journey. And that was in March of 2017. By December of that same year, I was in South Carolina celebrating Christmas with my birthday.
Right. So, because you found all of this information, which you're right, it is very overwhelming the first time around. You like you said, you have to be Sherlock Holmes, you have to dissect it, you have to sit with it for a little bit, and you have to feel your emotions as well.
Yeah.
Did this inspire you to write your current memoir? Is this something that that has inspired you to write the memoir that is now out?
I decided to write the memoir after I finally had my first phone conversation with my oldest birth sister.
Okay. So what was the conversation like briefly?
Well, I found her on LinkedIn.
Right.
Once I was able to, once I figured out why I couldn't find her with a traditional Google search, and I went through a rigmarole to do that, using my Sherlock Holmes skills. I finally tracked down somebody else who knew who she was, and said, "I think she still works for this company, and she's out in on the East Coast. She doesn't live in South Carolina anymore. She's the only member of the family who moved away from the birth home." And she said to me, "I knew about you. I just didn't know whether you were a boy or a girl. I just knew there was, Mom, our mother had intimated to her that there was this baby who was given up for adoption, and that was it. That's all she knew. Not a baby boy, not a baby girl, just a baby." And when she confronted her father about this, all he said was, "Yes, it's true, and don't ever ask me about it again." So now both my birth parents have passed.
Right.
Because I waited so long. I was late 50s, almost 60 when I decided to do this, because I had no interest in, I didn't need to.
Right.
And really the only reason I took this journey, as I try to say over and over, I didn't feel I had to do this. I had no hole in my soul.
Right.
I've read about that many times, and doctors saying I felt empty.
Yes.
I felt empty. I felt incomplete. And that was never my feeling at all. Which is why the title of the book is Already Home. In fact, the original title was Already Whole, Already Home.
Yeah.
And I cut it just to Already Home. It's like, I don't need to know this. So I didn't do this journey because I had to. I didn't do this journey because I needed to. I did it because I wanted to. I'm just like, okay, my curiosity bug has been turned on full blast. I want to know what's going on here. I'm just so curious. What am I going to learn? What new things about myself can I uncover?
Right.
And so I say, when I describe what it is that I do in my memoir, because I'm working on 2 other memoirs already. And I describe myself as a person who writes about personal transformation. And this journey about discovering my birth family and what I went through in the process is about personal transformation, about how I have grown and changed. I'm one in my late 60s who still embraces change. I'm not afraid of change. It's just part of life. I'm somewhat of a practicing Buddhist, and Buddhists will tell you that pleasure, that happiness, this is not a reward, and pain and suffering, this is not a punishment. They're just part of life. You either embrace it and lean into them, and if you don't, you're not living your full life. So I have many things I do. Set my intentions every day. I do morning prayers. I try to meditate. And I try to have a good cry every day and a belly laugh every day. Because if you only do one, you're not fully alive.
That's true.
You got to do them both. You got to do them both. And so, I work at finding a way to, it's like, I want to let that feelings out. So I experience both of these powerful emotions.
Right.
And funny thing is, I engaged a professional developmental editor to help me write this memoir. So I've been a writer all my life, but this is a different kind of writing. And it's about peeling back the layers.
Right. So
you look like you have a question.
So when you were writing your book, walk me through your writing process a little bit. I'm really excited to hear about it.
I've been a writer since I've been about 9 years old.
Same.
I wrote a couple of short stories that my mom kept. I don't know where they are. I think they're gone. My mom passed a long time ago.
Mm.
I wrote poetry in college,
Mhm.
and I did a master's degree in creative writing at Brown in poetry and poetics
Mhm.
and some literary translation. And then I went into advertising. So I was a copywriter and a creative director for many, many years. I've done some long form writing. I had a blog for many years, and then I've written 2 textbooks that are part of my advertising career, and I teach from those textbooks now. I launched a series of workshops that I do as a corporate trainer. It launched the podcast that I do called The Brief Brothers, which is about the subject of my books. But it wasn't until this whole adoption experience came into my consciousness that I realized there's a story to tell here. This is a great story. It is a combination of high drama, of tension, of personal transformation, of the research around adoption. When I finally reached out and connected with my birth family, and they invited me to come out to this little town in South Carolina, population about 400, for Christmas. I mean, I had made the decision that this is the story I need to tell. In February of the following year, 2018, I started writing. I've read a lot of interviews with authors, poets, short story writers, novelists, nonfiction writers, on their advice on how do you go about writing. If you're going to be a writer, how do you become a writer? And almost all of them say you got to write every day, and you got to set a target for how many words you write, and you got to 2 hours this day or do it. It's like I said, okay, and I thought, yeah, that's not going to work. That's just not. That's just not. I couldn't. I mean, I tried many times to do it that way, and it's like no. So I just and the way I went about memoir, which is, it may or may not be different from fiction, but I really never tried. I tried my hand at fiction and didn't really go anywhere because I wasn't all that interested in creating a world from scratch. Here I had my life right in front of me.
Right.
And what I love about memoir is that I don't have to write about my whole life. It's just, this is the section of my life I'm writing about.
Yes.
And the way I went about doing it was one scene at a time. Just take one memory and write about it. And it was a remarkable thing that happened. As I was writing about that one memory, all of a sudden 17 other memories came back. So, and so I've got these little notebooks, these little moleskin notebooks full of ideas, because you don't stop and write them down, you will forget them.
Yes.
And I do a daily journal. Every morning I wake up and I have a daily journal, and it can be just like, today I'm going to talk to Kat, and that's what I'm doing today, right? Mm-hmm. Or it could be, yesterday I went through all this. So I just became mindful that if you want to remember stuff, you got to write it down. And that's how I wrote this. And it was disjointed. There was no rhyme or reason to it. It wasn't in a chronological order. I just had these memories. I wrote them down. And then as I was also discovering the bits and pieces of my adoption through this adoption report, and then, going on this journey and taking a left turn and being stymied. It's like, I got to turn right here, and being stymied, and finally discovering, here's a phone number I can reach them. I write all this stuff down, and each one would produce a scene. Mm-hmm. And you have to write this book like you would write a screenplay, like you would write a novel. It's one scene at a time.
Right.
And don't tell, show. I mean, that's the oldest advice that any writer can get. Don't tell, show. Well, there's a time for telling and there's a time for showing. So I would, and my developmental editor berated me. She hit me over the head with metaphorical 2x4s. Use this scene. Recreate some dialogue. The reader will understand that you weren't there taking notes. You can recreate it from memory. They will forgive you if you don't get it right. They won't care. They just, as long as it continues, as long as there's some dramatic tension and it progresses from one scene to the next, they just want to hear what goes on in your mind and in your heart.
Right.
How did you feel about this? I can't tell you how many times I get an email from saying, how did you feel? How did you feel? And so I was standing there fully naked metaphorically speaking, by the time I got done. But that's how it happened, one scene at a time. And then my developmental editor helped me rearrange these scenes so that they came together in a logical sequence. And I went through many drafts before I got to where it is today. And I'm blessed to say that I've entered it in many, quite a few book festivals and award shows, and it's been acknowledged. I've won some awards for it, and the reviews have been nothing but raving and laudatory. So all that hard work has paid off. But I realize that I'm not the kind of writer who gets up at 5 a.m. and writes for 4 hours.
Right.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I will write for an hour one day. I'll write for a couple of hours the next day. I'll write for a couple of hours the next day, and then work will get in the way, and I can't write for 2 weeks.
Right.
And I'll come back and keep writing. But you know what? I've written 4 books this way.
Yeah, it works.
I've written 2 textbooks. I've written the memoir, and I've written a shorter biographical profile. And it's not the way some writers work.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way I work.
Right.
And I've long since stopped beating myself up by saying, Howard, you got to write 5 hours a day.
Right.
No, that's not the way it works for me. I have a system that works. So that's, if you're looking for advice, find a system that works for you and stick with it, and don't apologize. Don't worry if it's not the way everybody else does it. If it works for you, you got a system.
So now let's get into the book, right?
Okay.
So take me through the first couple of chapters. What are you trying to introduce? What different concepts are you bringing? How are you trying to make the reader feel?
I think 2 of the reviewers have praised me for the prologue that I wrote in the book, because it sets up the entire book.
Yes.
And they thought it was clever because it also it serves as bookends. The prologue is returned to at the end, and I bring everything together. And it was a little detail that I picked up. But most other people who read I handed my adoption report to some friends and family members, and they read the whole thing. But it's a detail that most people overlooked. I got a copy of the obituary,
right,
of my birth mother's first husband, who was killed in a tragic car accident in the town in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And I grabbed that and I said, the person who drove the car that killed this man made my life possible. It sounds macabre, but a man who committed, he was not, my birth mother accused him of being a murderer.
Right.
He was never even charged in this accident, but my birth mother hated him. It was a small town, so we knew about him. They didn't know each other, but she knew about him by reputation. He was a bit of a town drunk. So I said, oh my goodness, this man who killed my birth mother's husband made my life possible. If that hadn't happened, I would never have been born. Because my birth mother went on to meet this other man and get pregnant with me.
Right.
So that became the beginning of my story. And the first sentence is, George Watson is the father of my life, but he's not my father.
Right.
He killed a man so that I might live.
And that's very powerful. It's a very unique way to open up a memoir, let alone a story in general. But it's almost like you're hanging on a cliffhanger, but you're using it to open up the entire thing. So it feels like we're starting out in the middle, but you're kind of like, wait, we need to backtrack a bit. So I think it's
it was a tease. It was a tease.
Yeah.
And I eventually, when I went to this small town in South Carolina, I went to the very spot where that car accident took place, and I looked around and I said, wow, this is where it all happened. And I end up describing that scene in detail in the book, near the end of the book, and the powerful emotions that just washed over me as I was standing. I don't know the exact spot, but I'm standing on the general spot where this happened. It's like, this is where my life began.
Right.
What a blessing.
So
that I can be here right now.
Absolutely. And so your book is about self-transformation. Really, it's about your journey with yourself, dealing with who you were, who you are, and the person you want to become. And it's all stemming back to your outlook on the adoption aspect of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Walk me through it a little bit. Let's talk about the most important points in the book to you.
Well, there are quite a few that I could go through. One of the most joy-filled moments was when I discovered that the oldest birth sister and I
Right.
were both gay.
Oh.
She was in a committed relationship. Her partner just passed from a bout of cancer,
Oh.
so she's in a period of grief right now. But they were together for 30 some odd years.
Yeah.
And I'm bisexual. I came out when I was 18, and then I came out again, and when I was in my 40s, saying, you know what, I think I'm a little more complicated than just gay. I acknowledge that I had an attraction to both sexes, which in some regard is harder, than just, it's easy to say, I'm just gay, I'm just straight. But when you're like kind of in the middle, people say, well, are you 50% gay and 50% straight? I said, no, I'm 100% bisexual. That's the way to answer it. So when I discovered that she and I had this connection, it's like, that was a gift from our mother. Or maybe, because the only person that we have in common is our mother. Because I believe that it's a biological gift. It's a biological thing.
Right.
So that was a first joyous news that, like, oh, wow. And the other is that, well, I saw visual similarities between me and my birth family.
Right.
But there were also ways that we were completely different. So there's nature and there's nurture.
Yes.
Right. Nature made certain things that the shape of my nose and my eyes and my forehead. People would say, "Oh, you have the same eyes," and things like that. Okay, that I can't change. But there was nurturing things where my physique is completely different from everyone else's in the family. I guess another thing that I discovered was I was able to, as I was telling the story about my adoptive family as well as my birth family and drawing portraits of members of my family, I rediscovered a love for my adoptive family that I didn't realize I had. I had kind of a little bit of an issue with my mom.
Right.
Which not uncommon.
Of course.
We love our parents and we love to see them for 5 minutes and then we need to move on, right? So that doesn't change whether you're adopted or you're not. I never had any anger. Well, the anger that I felt toward my mom was trivial. And I realized as I was walking through this experience and writing about it, the more trivial these little things that bugged me became. They were this big when I started. It's like, no, that's just, why are you focusing on that? It became this big by the time. And there's a line in my book where I say, and it's near the end, and this is part of the big transformation that took place. The line is something like, I went searching for my birth mom, but I found mom.
Right.
In the process.
Yes.
I rediscovered a love for my adoptive mom in a way that I wasn't able to say to her, because she had cancer and then Alzheimer's. She disappeared before I could say these things to her.
Right.
So I said them to her in the book, and I say them to her in prayer.
Yeah.
And I was able to say all these things to my dad. He passed only 2 years ago. He lived to be 96. He lived a good long life. So I can say with complete honesty and joy that he and I were at peace with each other. We left no unfinished business before he passed.
Right.
I was with him. I actually shaved him while he was in hospice 4 hours before he passed. So it was wonderful. So there's not one thing, there's many things. And I guess another thing that I found, my birth family embraced me as if I'd just been away for a long time. And I know that's not always the case.
Yeah.
But I realized that had I been brought up there, I would have been just as loved as the family that raised me. So that was transformational as well. So I recognize that not everyone has the same experience as an adoptee, and I respect that and honor that. But there's a part of me that also says we make our own choices. You can choose to live in your trauma, or you can choose to overcome that trauma. And if there were traumatic experiences in my life, I'm no longer mired by them. I've overcome them. I look back on my experience as a blessing and as a gift. And that's an option that all of us have, but not all of us take it.
So how did you get to that mindset of every part of my trauma in the past is a blessing because it helped me get here and it made me stronger? I always say that trauma makes a resilient person. And
yes.
So I'm curious to know how you came to this process as well.
Well, I didn't know that I was traumatized until I was told I was traumatized.
Who told you that?
So I didn't experience Nancy Verrier.
Okay. Interesting.
She said, you're traumatized. It's like, okay, look, I will accept the premise. I get it. You take an infant from its birth mother and give it to another person. I get it. That makes intuitive sense. My adoptive mom doesn't look, I was 27 days old when I came home with mom and dad. And all of a sudden, I'm in the arms of this new woman, and she doesn't look like my birth mom. She doesn't smell like my birth mom. She doesn't taste like my birth mom. Like, who is this person? And I'm at a stage in my life where I can't articulate any of this.
Right.
I'm preconscious, right?
Yeah.
Somehow, in a way that I can't explain, I got to be where I am at 58 years old, and I'm fine. Right? Now, did I live a perfect life? No. Who does? Do I have my shortcomings? Absolutely. Am I a flawed person? Absolutely. And I'm mindful of that. It's like I believe that I'm a perfect spiritual being. I'm a spiritual person, and I'm created in the image of God, and I'm perfect in that way. My human incarnation,
right,
needs some work. I'm working on that stuff right now, and that's part of the experience of writing the book. Is like working on the human incarnation, right?
Right.
But no one said to me anywhere along my path until I got to 50, 58, and I found out about these 2 books on adoption. No one said to me, Howard, because you were an adoptee, you're in deep shit.
Right.
And no one ever said to me, you're the adopted child. You're lucky to be where you are. Count your blessings, buddy. You could have been, no one ever said that to me. Everybody in the family, everybody embraced me. My mom used to call me, and I don't know what she meant by this because I never asked her, but she said, my number one son. But I think she just meant I was the first member of the family. So I'm the number one son. But I like to take it the other way too. It's like, yep, you don't mean it. Maybe you don't mean it this way, but yeah, I'm your favorite.
Right. Right. Oh, I love that. So.
Right. So there was no point where I said, I'm screwed up here because I'm adoptee. It wasn't until I read these books.
Right.
And that's where I need to transition because in 2020, I was at my third draft of this memoir.
Right.
And I'd already done one full rewrite. Starting over from scratch because it just needed it. In 2020, 2.5 years, almost 3 years after I started writing this, I stumbled across a video on YouTube with Michael Grand, Dr. Michael Grand, who wrote a book called The Adoption Constellation. And he was saying in this video, it was a 17-minute video, hosted by an adoption specialist who was full on board with Nancy Verrier. Full on board. Accepted everything she said, drank the Kool-Aid. And here's Michael Grand saying, yeah, well, I got a problem with Nancy Verrier.
Okay.
Her research sucks. Her research is flawed. You need to read my book, The Adoption Concept. I got onto to Amazon and I ordered the book the next day, or that same day.
Right.
And was pissed. I was pissed at Amazon because the book wasn't available on Prime and I couldn't get it in 2 days. I had to wait a whole week.
Oh my gosh.
I had to wait a whole week for this book to come in. When it arrived, I inhaled it in an afternoon. His argument is essentially this. If you are fully embraced by your adoptive family, especially the grandparents, if you were never treated as a second-class citizen, if you're always just the family member, the son, the daughter, not the adopted son, not the adopted daughter. And if especially the grandparents accept you in this way, and everyone else in your community, your neighbors, the teachers, the police officers, everybody that you encounter just accepts you as a member of the family, this allows you as an adoptee to write your own narrative. And I'm quoting directly, to write your own narrative.
Yeah.
I think he meant it as a metaphor, but it's, in other words, I get to decide who I am. And I know, as I recall, I had one incident, and I wrote about this in the book. I had one incident in my entire life where adoption became a possible inhibitor, a possible obstacle for me. I was in high school. I was trying out for junior varsity basketball team. I'd been a basketball player when I was in grade school. I'd been a basketball player, was in freshman year. I wanted to be on the junior varsity squad, and the junior varsity squad was the feeder for varsity.
Right.
So the junior varsity coach was looking to see who's going to really become a good player. Right? I wasn't thinking in those terms. I just wanted to play basketball with my buddies. So he lined us up and started asking each of us a question, and I couldn't quite, we were all lined up in a row, and he just went one to the other and to the other to the next, and I couldn't quite hear what he was asking them, but I was like, what is he asking? He finally got within a couple of people, and I could hear him ask a question, and he got to me, and he looked at me and said, how tall is your father?
Yeah.
I said, okay, well, because I was about 5'8" in high school, and I'm 5'10" now. That's as tall as I was ever going to get.
Right.
I was maybe 5'8" in high school. And at that age, and I said, well, my dad is 5'6", but that doesn't have anything to do with me because I was adopted. And my coach looked at me and said, I don't believe you. I didn't understand. I said, well, what do you mean you don't believe me? So my dad was, I don't believe you. And within earshot, I had a bunch of people who I'd known since I was in grade school, right? Since in kindergarten. They'd been friends of mine forever. And they knew that I was adopted. And they spoke up and they said, yeah, he's telling you the truth. He's adopted.
Right.
And finally the coach said, okay. I'm not going to argue with you. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized he was asking that because he wanted to get an idea of how tall I was going to be. Was I going to get to be tall enough to play on the varsity team?
Right.
I didn't know where he was going with that question. I just what?
Right.
And I didn't end up making varsity because I got tired of basketball. I got onto the JV team and I played, and it's like I wasn't going to be a first stringer even on JV, so I was going to make it to varsity.
Right.
What I remember that event is what I recall, what was powerful for me was my friends just speaking up for me. They coming to my defense without me asking them. They just, yeah, he's adopted. And it was like, yeah, he's got brown hair. Yeah, he's a guy. Yeah, he's an adoptee. It's like, it was just no big deal to them. And that was the only time that being an adoptee was an issue.
Right.
And I realized it really wasn't an issue. It just showed to me how my friends just accepted me. It was just kind of a cool thing. Hey, he's adopted. So I'll meet you for lunch, okay? It's like, it was just a fact.
I think that's a very interesting point that you bring up from what you discovered, because I do find that adoptees who are very accepted by their families, by their communities, by even just, like you say, police officers, maybe their church, just by everyone around them, they're more likely to be like, I don't need to know about my past because this is my present. The past has no effect on me. And I believe that you make a point of that in the book because you had so much love from your adoptive family, who is your family, and not just, like you just said, not just family, but the whole community. So that just strengthens your own tie to the fact that you didn't really need to know. You were curious, and I think every adoptee is going to be curious, and it's okay to be curious, but it didn't matter as much as it matters to many other adoptees.
Well, my curiosity was late in blooming.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But I think I would highly recommend adoptees read Michael Grand's book, The Adoption Constellation. It's an easy read. And he essentially tears apart Nancy Verrier's arguments. And the biggest flaw in Nancy Verrier's arguments is that she is a practicing psychologist who has an adoption practice. She works with adoptees.
Right.
The flaw in her logic is that she confuses clinical research for scientific research.
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean? She studied only the people who came to see her for treatment. And who are those people? The people who were having problems being adoptees.
Right.
True scientific research would do a comparison between a control group and the adoptees who are having problems. So essentially, she never talked to people like me,
Right.
or you,
Right.
for that matter. She only talked to people who came to her with a problem, and that became her world. And if you read her work carefully, once I understood Michael Grand's argument, I went back and looked at what Nancy Berry was saying. I said, "Oh, wow! It is crystal clear to me now that she is even saying in her conclusions, these are what the adoptees are telling me."
Right.
Well, what she didn't say was, these are the adoptees who came to me for help are telling me.
Right.
And she conflated clinical research for scientific research, and that is the fundamental flaw. So yes, there's trauma, but it doesn't mean you're automatically and permanently wounded for the rest of your life.
Right.
Because the flaws that she identified for adoptees happen in the general population as well. Just because you do one thing and you're an adoptee doesn't mean that others who are not adoptees don't behave that way too. So you can't say, well, he's screwed up because he's an adoptee. Well, you could be screwed up and not be an adoptee. Right. We all know that, right? So I highly recommend his book as a counterfactual to Nancy Berry. And I think a lot of professionals are now changing their thinking about this so-called wound. That it may exist, but it doesn't have to inhibit your life and stop you from living a full life.
So how do you address this in your memoir?
Well, I explain. I without, I didn't want to turn my memoir into a textbook, but I did highlight the arguments that Nancy Berry presented. And then when I discovered Michael Grand, I said, oh my goodness, here is my savior. I wanted to find something besides just my lived experience.
Right.
To demonstrate that my belief had a basis in fact. And I shared, a top line explanation of Michael Grand's thinking. And I actually reached out to him and had an hour-long FaceTime conversation with him.
Wow.
And he's an adoptee himself.
Right.
Right. He's a practicing, I think he's on the faculty. I forget where he's on the faculty, but he got his PhD in New York. And he's probably close to retirement now, but I did have a conversation with him. And when I launched my book, he sent me an email, offering his congratulations. So what it did for me was confirm that what I believed was true. Right. But I wanted more than just my beliefs. I wanted some evidence. I wanted some research, some counterfactual, and he provided it. And I think for adoptees out there who are questioning, am I damaged goods? I don't feel like I'm damaged goods. Hang on to that belief, but read Michael Grand and he'll demonstrate for you. And even if you had a bad experience growing up, if your adoptive family wasn't ideal, there are plenty of birth families who weren't ideal too, right? We all know that. Your joy comes from within. You're never going to find happiness from outside. You have the choice to be happy, to live a productive, fulfilling life. Don't let this thing that happened to you when you were, 2 weeks old or 3 years old or 15 years old turn you into a martyr or a victim. That's your choice. So
sum up your novel in 1 to 2 sentences.
Joy comes from within. No matter what your experience is, joy comes from within. And the journey I took confirmed that. It really did.
So where can we get your novel? Where can we find this memoir?
It's on Amazon and on anywhere you can find books online, and Barnes and Noble. You can go to my website, howardfrederickibach.com. Well, you can't buy it on my website, but it links to but you can read the reviews.
The reviews are very, very good. I've actually read the reviews. They're fantastic. So
thank you.
I'm very excited to pick up my own copy.
Well, I appreciate that. Yes, yeah. Spread the word.
Definitely. There's a Barnes and Noble right near me, so I'm excited. I love bookstores.
I don't think it's only print on demand. It's not I have my own publishing label, mm-hmm. Juju Books. So it's my own, it's self-published through my own label, so it's not available in stores, as they used to say.
Oh, it's limited edition. That makes it even better.
Yeah, you can only get it online.
Okay. So we can order it online through his website or through Amazon or any
through Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can actually get it, on Target.com and Walmart.com. I mean, a lot of these online retailers do offer the book.
I love that. So I will definitely be picking up a copy. And to those who are listening, you should too, to find out his journey and how he transformed himself from where he was to where he is now. Thank you all for joining me on this episode of Chats with Kat. A very special thank you to our guest, Howard. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, rate, and share this episode so that Howard's voice and story can be heard. Be sure to check out our Patreon page to receive exclusive membership perks and leave us feedback about our episodes. And always remember, someone somewhere is thinking of you. You are not alone.